Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In today's first segment, we're going to discuss Germany and three major events that have occurred there, which are disturbing. Each of them individually is disturbing enough, but we want to talk about all three of them together. The first, and of course, arguably the most important, is the attack on the synagogue in Halle in Germany by Stefan who's been arrested, is a 27-year-old German. The German government saying at this point in time, the Interior Minister, saying that it's highly likely that this attacker was linked to far-right extremism, and certainly many of the statements that he made in the lead-up to this attack were obviously anti-Semitic and would lean obviously towards the far right. He even admitted that he saw the Christchurch massacre shooter as inspirational. Now, the other event is a terror investigation after 8 people have been injured by a lorry ramming. A Syrian man has been arrested in connection with that incident that occurred in the Offenbach area near Frankfurt. And finally, then there is a speech by Lutz Bachmann, who heads the xenophobic group Pegida. He used Nazi slogans to describe his opponents, calling them even to be killed, and the crowd also then greeted those cheers and calls by him with cries of "hang them." And now, as I said, each of these individually will be disturbing enough, but we want to talk about essentially what really is happening in Germany. Why are such violent actions and language growing across that country at this time? Let's discuss that further. We're joined now by Wafaa Albadry, who is a journalist and an expert in foreign affairs and immigration issues. She's joining us now from Berlin. We're also joined from Berlin by Joel Schalit, who is a political expert, editor of the Battleground EU, and is also the author of several books. Joel and Wafaa, thank you both for your time today. Joel, I'd like to start with you. Let's go step by step, then, if we may. What do you make of the synagogue attack? Why do you think this is occurring in 2019 in Germany?
For the last 5 years, the German far right has grown increasingly emboldened by public anxiety about the immigration crisis, following the 2015 influx of nearly 1 million migrants, largely from the Middle East. There is a strong consensus in Germany today that anti-migrant anxiety incubates anti-Semitism. They are intimately connected. You cannot have Islamophobia without anti-Semitism and vice versa. The two are mutually supportive and grow each other. It should be no surprise that this attack took place on the 9th, on Reunification Day. There is a desire to redefine Germany along national lines in a way that was denied a lot of people in the East, culturally following the collapse of the DDR. There is a sense that the residents of the East politically need to have a greater stake now than before because they've been so disenfranchised. Of course, they're going to take on minorities.
Indeed. Wafaa, what are your thoughts about this? It's not like there's just one kind of terrorism occurring within Germany. It's both far-right extremism and what's traditionally been seen as terrorism, as you well know, by the mainstream, i.e. terrorism possibly carried out by anybody who is Muslim/Arab in any way. Why is this growing in Germany, do you think?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't recognize as it's different ways or different categories of terrorism. Terrorism is one thing, it's hate and it's aggression. And it's not acceptable in either or all the cases that we are facing. And it's the same, like the fascists or the haters are thinking all the same. It doesn't matter where they come from, where they grew up, or where they have been socialized. At the end, they are committing hate crimes against humanity, and we should look at it on an equal level. That's first. Second, I think that it is there in Germany since a very long time. It's not, yes, we see it more because maybe in the media it has more presence in the last 5 years, but hate crimes like this exist in Germany. I think it have never stopped. Maybe for a couple of years, but then it comes back. Maybe sometimes it's like this, a mass shooter, like these. Maybe this type of mass shooters it's new, but there have been individual crimes. There were people sometimes pushed in front of the train because of hate, because of race, or because of also anti-Semite attacks have been happening since a very long time. So I wouldn't say it stopped in Germany and it's coming back in the last 5 or 10 years, but I would say maybe people would see more because the far right wing in whole Europe is growing, and now what we see now at the moment is like like when the cup is full and you just see what's on the surface. What worries me, and I think what worries so many even foreigners, if we could say that, living in Germany, is that would grow to the extent that the German authorities cannot include it anymore or cannot control it anymore.
Okay. Now Wafaa, if I may come in, because that's a good point, because I wanted to in fact bring that up, if I may, because even in this case, when it came to the attack on the synagogue, there has been some criticism of German authorities as well, intelligence-wise, or there's been several levels of that sort of criticism as well. Do you think that at this point in time that maybe for free speech's sake, that a lot of hate speech has actually been allowed? And I'm going to refer for a moment to that Pegida group's leader, Lutz Bachmann, and his speech. Again, it wasn't necessarily racist in a traditional sense, where he wasn't just talking about one group of people. He was talking about his political opponents, but again, using Nazi slogans, asking them to be killed, etc. All of that creates an atmosphere of hate, doesn't it? Why has that even been allowed?
Lutz Bachmann has it coming. He's had it coming for a long time. What Bachmann is so good at is incitement, and whether he's recycling terms from the Nazi era or not, he creates a climate of fear through his invective, and he should have been prosecuted a long time ago. And this is the case for many people on the German far right, including the country's largest opposition party, Alternative for Deutschland. There are many things that its leadership and its very public membership say in public that is discriminatory, that constitutes in any other constitutional context outside of Germany hate speech, and is liable for prosecution within a German legal context by itself for that reason alone. The authorities here, I've lived in Germany for 10 years, and I live in a largely Muslim neighborhood called Neukölln in southeastern Berlin. And I have witnessed the worst public outbursts of racism on the part of opposition parties and public officials of a kind that I never would have seen in any of the other countries I've lived in Europe. And my sense is that the Merkel government has been, in the coalitions she's led, reluctant to get tough because, for example, her conservative coalition partners, the Christian Democratic Union, often recycles a lot of language from the far right itself, and they don't want to alienate too many right-wingers. That's my opinion.
Okay, so then Wafaa, what are your thoughts on then allowing for this sort of a thing to just foster? Because as you were saying, now the cup is full and now it's essentially spilling over, and what we're seeing is that spillover only. We're not even talking about the full cup as such right now, and the root causes, which I'm sure go back several years or more, arguably. Why haven't authorities been proactive? Is it just, as Joel there alluded to, is it just because of politics?
I think there are no tools, there are no implemented tools to deal with hate speech. This is now clearer on internet, for example, and I agree that certain areas in Berlin are witnessing different dynamics, dealing like the authority are dealing with different dynamics with the residents, especially if they are foreigners or so on. And I think specifically for the hate speech and the hate actions, there are no clear tools for the authorities that they are using. They are dealing with relevantly old laws, and these old laws are not allowing to stop actions once it's happening. Going to prosecution processes is very, 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 very long, and if we are just talking about the political well, we see already some breaking of rules. As you say, Bachmann is already doing that, but also a couple of weeks ago, there were in the parliament a parliamentarian who was talking about the anti-fascism movement, and there were another parliamentarian who waved out maybe potentially the Hitler sign in the parliament. And then there were a big debate in the news whether that was real, like he did that by intention, or that was just a wave by his arm, and so on and so forth. But this is actually giving some kind of signs to these sleeping cells of Nazis or neo-Nazis to move or to do something. I'm not claiming here that that was a sign for someone, but I mean that just encourages these people to make actions. If the reaction of such things is not very clear, that and condemning that very clearly, that would give a sign to these sleeping cells maybe to move.
Indeed. Okay, we'll leave that as a final word, but that was a very good pertinent to end off on, because it seems that a lot of these far-right, at least extremists, look for any sort of sign to be encouraged in moving forward. I'll thank Wafaa and Joel for their time today and for, of course, putting this conversation into context for us. Again, we were honing in, viewers, on three major events: the synagogue attack, the truck or lorry ramming in Offenbach near Frankfurt, and also, of course, Bachmann's speech. He's the group head of Pegida, which we know is a xenophobic group there, not just, in Germany, but across Europe, in fact, in many countries. And it seems that, again, that for the rest of us on the outside, Germany has always been spoken of as a very peaceful country, etc., but it seems that it's not been like that in reality on the ground, that these sorts of things have been simmering for many, many years and have been occurring for many years, but now is just spoken of more, seemingly, out in the mainstream and on social media, certainly very worrying signs. If neo-Nazi groups are able to now speak like this and to act in this fashion in violent ways, be it just through words or actual physical actions, certainly something that the authorities there in Germany should be immediately alarmed about and looking into changing laws to make them tougher about such actions. We'll keep a close eye on that here in Scope. I'll be back though with my next segment after this. Stay tuned. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss the UN Special Rapporteur on Racism, Damjanović, who has said that the Netherlands is not socially inclusive and tolerant, and in reality, in fact, and I'm quoting her now, treats racial and ethnic minorities as perpetually foreign, end quote. She was speaking in part about the Dutch ban on the burqa, which is a full-face veil worn by some Muslim women who choose to do so. That ban, which is less strict, in fact, than some other EU countries, is partial in that it applies only on public transport and public buildings, such as schools and hospitals, and not in other public spaces, such as on the streets or in the vicinity of public offices. Police at the time that this was brought in had said that they would not, in fact, be enforcing it simply because it was too hard to enforce it. But nevertheless, this is an important conversation to be having because the UN Special Rapporteur on Racism brought it up, and this just then brings back the conversation about racism. And if at the root of all of this, there is really Islamophobia/racism, however we want to term it. Let's discuss that a bit further. We're joined now by Peter Wierenga, who is a journalist and writer, who is joining us now from Amsterdam. Thank you for your time today. Do you think it's true, the accusation that the UN Special Rapporteur on Racism put forth about the Netherlands?
Well, actually, I would say I have to disagree with that. It is true that the burqa ban is targeting especially Muslim women, although it is a small minority. The estimates are about 200 to 400 Muslim women who are wearing the burqa or the niqab. And the argument which the government gave when it introduced the law was that the burqa is actually an obstacle to social inclusion, because it is harder when you wear a burqa to communicate, which is especially a problem concerning education in schools, universities, and of course in medical situations in hospitals. So I think that the government would argue the other way around, saying that trying to convince women not to wear the burqa, at least not in these specific environments, would actually lead to a more inclusive way of living for them, being more socially accepted. On the other hand, you could argue that that it is, of course, an infringement on the right of people how to dress themselves. So there is, of course, something to say for that.
Yeah.
And especially when we talk about public transport, because there the argument is not about communication, but it is about security. So I think there are two arguments, and I would say that leads to a distorted discussion.
Okay, so but then do you think
yes.
that it's important, though, Peter, to be having such conversations openly in the Netherlands, where again I think it's in the sense that the UN Rapporteur on Racism brought it up, possibly because again the image, obviously, in many of these countries, or the image that they portray to the rest of the world, is that these are extremely tolerant countries and societies, and no one is saying that obviously that they're not at all tolerant. But I mean, do you think that there is a need to talk about racism openly and to address it openly as well?
Yes, I do think, but I think there is another more serious issue, which is about discrimination when it comes to jobs and when it comes to social positions. This is a serious subject, and also I think the UN rapporteur also raised the question of the whistleblower in the Hague Police Department, who said that there are racially motivated sentiments of foreigners among the police squad. Yeah. I think this is a serious issue, and I think this is a lot more important issue than the burqa ban.
Okay.
Because this concerns many more people, many more immigrants, or sons or daughters of immigrants, because let's not forget we're talking about second and third generation. Indeed. And I would say that it is very important that we try to include all these people in our society.
Okay, so Peter, what do you make? I think it's important, right, to understand that this, for the large part, comes down to a woman's choice, and certainly that should be respected. But then how does then one parallel this or justify this within a Western construct and Western society where the main country's values, or Netherlands' values, or Dutch values, I should say, may be different? Can Dutch values accept a woman in a burqa?
I would say that the big problem with the burqa ban, for me, it's not the ban itself, but it actually is raising another question, namely, these women now feel treated differently, and that makes them in their group a bit of, let's say, heroes or martyrs, and they are demonstrating against the law. And I think that because of this, there's a lot of more attention than I would wish to this relatively small group. But on the other hand, I do think that the burqa does not fit into Western society, because the burqa itself, even when a woman chooses to wear it, is really an obstacle to communication, which is what Western societies are basically about. We feel that sexes are equal and that they should be dressed equal. I mean, not the same, but the idea behind the burqa does not fit in. On the other hand, is it effective? I do believe that sometimes it might be better to try to, start a dialogue and try to convince women not to wear a burqa, or their husbands, because we don't know if it's always out of free choice, out of free will. So I think it is, of course, it is. You should be tolerant, but can you also be tolerant of things that you judge to be?
But then I imagine if I may come in, Peter, because I'm wondering that if a woman strongly believes that she wants to wear the burqa for her own religious reasons, whether, we're not going to talk about whether that's legitimate or not, that's her personal belief, right? So if a woman strongly believes that she must be wearing the burqa, wouldn't it then be oppressive to actually tell her you shouldn't be wearing the burqa? You know what I mean?
Well, I agree, but on the other hand, I think that it should be the right, I'm still not sure if you should put it in a law, but I think that hospitals and schools and universities should have the right to say, if you wear a burqa, we just, you don't fit into our educational system, or we can't communicate with you, or when you are a patient, we have to examine you, so this is, in that case, the burqa will be an obstacle to participation in society. So, and still, it's still allowed to wear a burqa, walk on the street and in your home, etc., but not in specific places. The main thing I am, I am skeptical about is to forbid it in public transport, because I would almost say, if you put it, it's better that they go with public transport than by driving a car themselves if you wear a burqa. But that's just a joke. But I do think it takes the attention away from the bigger issue. So I don't think it's racially motivated, burqa ban. I don't think the Dutch government or the Dutch people treat minorities as perpetually foreign, but
okay, Peter, I'm going to have to interrupt you. I do apologize. The clock is best of us, but that was Peter speaking to us from Amsterdam, and Ernest was joining us from Faro, although he is originally based in Amsterdam. Of course, we appreciate their insight and their comments on this, though, of course, I do disagree with them mostly on this issue, but certainly it's important to have these discussions out in the open, because these are sensitive topics to be talking about. And I imagine that the UN rapporteur bringing up this issue, UN rapporteur on racism, I should say, bringing up this issue is an important thing, because again, such conversations need to happen more openly and more often, so that there is more understanding on both sides about why this is in fact sensitive and important to either side, so that again, some resolution and some understanding and tolerance can be created on both sides again. Certainly a woman's right to be able to dress in a certain fashion if she believes strongly in something certain religious for her personally, that's an important right to uphold anywhere in the world, certainly. And of course, in a Western world, which always touts its moral values to the rest of the world, that's even more important, I believe. We'll be back with my last segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. Now, in this segment of the show, we're going to discuss a World Bank report which just come out. We're going to hone in on Africa, because in that report, it's spoken about how 4 in 10 Africans, or over 416 million people, lived on less than $1.90 per day in 2015. And now, extreme poverty, according to this report, will almost exclusively become an African phenomenon by 2030, with 90% of the world's poor projected just to live on that continent. That is up from 55% in 2015, mind you, and would happen unless, of course, drastic action is taken. Now, the many reasons that the report lists are obviously quite detailed as far as GDP growth and slow growth in many of these countries, and weak policies, economic policies, that is, and the list can really go on. But I wonder, of course, what part the rest of the world may have played in ensuring that Africa remains poor, or will be poor going forward as well. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're joined now by Mercy Abang, who is a journalist and development journalist, in fact, and she's joining us now from Abuja in Nigeria. We're also joined by Manu Lekunze, who is a politics and international relations professor at the University of Aberdeen. He's author of Inherent and Contemporary Challenges to African Security. He's joining us now from Aberdeen. And joining us now from Belgrade in Serbia is Tijana Damjanović Gertner, who is an economic analyst. She's chief product officer at Anchor AG, which is a stable coin pegged to economic growth. Tijana, Manu, and Mercy, thank you to all three of you for your time today. Tijana, I'd like to start with you because, in such reports, when poverty is spoken of, again, it's spoken of in very technical terms about, GDP growth, et cetera, and why that is contributing, slow GDP growth, mind you, is contributing to poverty on the continent. That doesn't really put this into human terms, though, right? How important is it to translate this into the fact that these are human beings that are poor and are suffering because of this?
Yes. Usually when people are discussing economic growth, they're focusing on numbers primarily. However, they fail to see the human factor in it. When it comes to why this is happening, we can't say that Africa is to blame for it. When it comes to the why aspect, we can go back to the colonial era to find some culprits. We can go back to the fallout of the Bretton Woods Agreement, or we can look closer to home and pay attention to local governments whose actions resemble a lot those of Europe during the 90s. I don't know how familiar you are with what was going on here back then, but basically cross-border disagreements left very little space for countries to pay attention to the poorest demographic layer. Add to that fact that wealth distribution is clearly class separated in Africa, where we don't really have the lower or higher middle class, but clear cuts between these classes with a wide gap between them. And it becomes a lot easier to understand why it's so easy for people to slip into poverty and so easy for them to get out of it, to rise above and to improve their station and their life conditions.
And Manu, I wonder where your thoughts are on this, because, it always boggles my mind that Africa is a continent that is so rich in resources, minerals. I mean, the list really goes on, and yet Africans are so poor. How does that make sense in your mind?
I think your previous discussant said, she briefly mentioned colonialism. So you would have to go back to how African states were created and how in the very beginning the states were more or less just territories for European powers to exploit for their own economies. Since independence, most African economies are still orientated around the colonial economic system, where Africa produces raw materials for European economies. So this makes African economies incredibly vulnerable to price fluctuations that are outside of the control of African states. So that system where Africa produces resources for other economies is how vulnerable Africa is economically. Yeah. The second thing is the size of African countries. Most African countries are very small. So economics of scale is a really big problem in Africa. And more individual African countries are more linked to their European powers than their neighbors. Yeah. So it's easier to fly from Paris to Abuja, for example, than it is to fly from Douala to Lagos or Abuja. So that the internal barriers between African states is a key problem. The third most important problem is the third most important problem is the mere fact that while Africa is very rich in mineral resources, the vast majority of the African territory is very hostile. You can look at the deserts and the Sahelian regions. It's very hostile to humans, and people have to kind of cram into smaller parts of the continent to try to make a living, which is. But
really I wonder, Manu. A lot of people, I imagine, those who certainly would take colonialism into account, would still, if I'm playing devil's advocate for a moment, say, listen, it's been a significant number of years now since colonial powers left Africa. Why haven't respective governments changed then laws and changed the way they function if they know that this is a continuing problem, economically or otherwise?
And it's a very valid question, and people will ask that question all around the world. No African or no sensible person would want to defend how Africa has been run since independence. But at the same time, you have to understand that there are constraints within the international system that prevent certain type of decisions and actions.
Okay.
So, yes, Africa has been run very badly, and no one should pretend that it hasn't been run very badly since independence, but it's done within an environment where very little can be achieved.
Okay, so let me go to Mercy now. Mercy, you are in Nigeria itself. So tell about the on-the-ground realities then when it comes to poverty that you may see around you and across Africa. Is this down to historical colonialism? Is this down to mismanagement? Is it a combination of both? How does one deal with it?
In Nigeria at the moment, we're dealing with extreme poverty. And when we say extreme poverty, we're not just saying poverty in hundreds. We're saying millions of people, about 90 million Nigerians are extremely poor. So that means that there's also a leadership problem where we've not really had a leadership that has decided to make a conscious and a deliberate decision to ensure that every Nigerian, to an extent, is lifted out of poverty. So if you ask me, my feedback on that is going to put 60 or 70% of the burden on the Nigerian political leadership and the elite. So we're dealing with a situation where we've had governments over the years on and off that just come into power and is much about lifting people out of poverty, and economy, insecurity works together. And that is also revealed with the number of insecurity challenges across the country.
Yeah.
The resources keep shrinking. The population is at a number that is unprecedented as compared to where Nigeria was before independence. So sometimes I try as much as possible, while I understand how colonialism affects African countries, for a case like Nigeria, I always try to put the burden as much as I can on the feet of the leadership structure that understands that resources aren't as much as we used to have them. This is a country that its mainstay is on oil production, and since the 60s to date, where there was oil boom in this country, what was the resources used for, and how was it used for? We've seen other countries where they also had as much oil as Nigeria is having, and we've seen the level of development there. So we really need to. For me, I think the issue is that we haven't really had a political will, and that decides to say we really need to focus on the growth and the development of our people.
Okay, so Tijana, I want to bring you back in, because, if I go back to the issue of colonialism, because, I've read a bit about this recently, and there is talk, Tijana, as you may well know, about reparations on the part of colonial powers, etc. Is that the path that this should go down? Because, the World Bank then also mentioned that a lot of these African countries are in debt distress or in high risk of external debt, and that, in fact, risk has doubled recently. That all doesn't sound like very good news, obviously, for any continent or any countries, respective countries within Africa, trying to then grow themselves or develop themselves. And we know that a lot of colonial powers did take a lot of the resources out of the country, as Manu there mentioned as well. Is it time for reparations, do you think?
I don't feel that reparations would fix all of the underlying issues that exist here. Yes, they might help short term, but if you look at other options that exist in some of the African countries that are in most trouble, people have two options, which are either humanitarian help or working for incredibly low wages. I feel that the solution doesn't lie in traditional financial markets or tactics, which is one of the reasons why I'm working with a stable coin. If you find a new resource, a new way to help people who are unbanked, people who are suffering for high inflation rates, like Zimbabwe, for instance, you can provide them with financial tool that is non-inflationary, which will enable them to maintain the value of what they're holding.
Yeah.
Add to that the fact that if governments were to change the way they're running things, and I know this sounds incredibly naive, but from an ideological standpoint, it is possible that if you stop chasing to be competitive with your prices on the market, you give realistic prices to things that other countries do need from you. But put realistic prices and your country will benefit from it.
Okay. All right, so let me get a final word from Manu there before we all go. Manu, just in under a minute, if you can, please, just give us your final thoughts on this, because I know this is an incredibly vast topic, obviously, to be touching, but do you think that, again, that the solutions lie within Africa itself? Is it just, does this need to be an African-led process, or does the greater international community need to come in to help in this case?
I think the key thing to say is that the problem would have to be solved or be led by Africans. But, Africa is in the world. You can't isolate Africa from the world. We have to, the confusion that really is at the heart of African poverty is people to talk about how rich Africa is in terms of resources. But really, you don't eat diamonds. You can't drink uranium or oil. African riches are riches because other people value it.
Yeah.
The people living in Africa did not know that diamonds were valuable before someone said they were. So Africa is incredibly poor in the resources that Africans need. So people have to thinking away from natural resources like diamonds and gold and start focusing on things like water, good agricultural land, skills, healthcare, the kind of things that would transform lives in Africa rather than digging the soil for gold and diamonds and petrol.
We'll leave it there for now, though. We appreciate Mercy, Manu, and Tijana for their time today, and of course for putting this all into context for us. As I said to Manu there as well, I know that this is a very vast topic, but it's an important one to discuss, because whenever we talk about Africa, we keep saying that it's a resource-rich continent, and why on earth is it poor? But then we don't contextualize the fact that this was a continent that was colonized by much of Europe and the rest of the world as well in some cases, and that reparations have not occurred. There has not been proper accounting for the fact that those resources were taken out of the country many times. There's no accounting for the fact that many global corporations go in and just essentially exploit African soil, African resources, and take those resources out of the country. So then again, it's not Africa which is being enriched, but it's corporations or other countries outside of the continent that are enriching themselves. And then of course there's issues of corruption, mismanagement, et cetera, that we can obviously list. But all of that needs to be discussed again out in the open. We'll keep a close eye on that, of course, as always, here in Scope. I'll leave it there for now, though. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.